a very rare and wonderful saint. I especially love her sense of humor, her great intelligence and learning, and also just the fact that she struggled just as we do with meditation and prayer. So anyway, I have a little story here to read about her life, and I hope you find inspiration in it as I have. Teresa of Avila was born in 1515. So you have to think that just a few years before that, Christopher Columbus had discovered America, and just 2 years after she was born, Luther started the Protestant Reformation. So it was a time of tremendous change in the world, and Teresa was born to point the way out of that outer turmoil and into the inner consciousness, inner peace. So Teresa's father was very rigid. He was honest and pious, but he was one who carried strictness to extremes. He was also Jewish, and the family converted to Catholicism just to escape the tremendous discrimination against Jews at that time in Spain. So Teresa of Avila was Jewish. I love that. Teresa's mother loved romance novels, but Teresa power outage.
Can you all hear us? Why don't you chime in if we're still good here? I'm hoping we are, but
Say something in the chat window if you can hear us.
throw a chat out there telling us you're with us, because otherwise we've got to reconnect. Yeah. I guess I have myself.
Stand by. And if you can hear us, write something in the chat window. Otherwise, we're flying blind here. Well, as I was saying, maybe I'm talking to myself, but I'll continue. Teresa was Jewish, which I love, and her mother loved romance novels, but her father was very against them. So this was the 16th century. A lot of chivalry and all that sort of thing in the romance novels, not the steamy stuff that we see today, but even so, her father was very against them. So this was a point of contention. Her mother hid the novels so her father wouldn't find them or know that she was reading them. And Teresa loved them too. So are we back? Do we know?
I think so, but I haven't.
Nobody said anything. So Teresa loved the novels too, but her mother told her not to tell her father, and she was instructed not to lie. She didn't want to lie. That was impious. So she was caught in the middle between lying to her father and protecting her mother, whom she loved. So she felt that she was just going to be wrong no matter what she did. It was very difficult for her. So feeling like a sinful person, just as a little girl, at age 7, she decided that she was going to become a martyr, and that would expiate all of her sins at 7 years old. So she convinced her brother to go with her to the Holy Land, and they were just going to go up to the first moors that they saw and give themselves up and ask to be killed as martyrs. So they made it all the way to the wall of the city, the outside wall of the city, and they were just outside the wall of the city when an uncle found them and took them home. So this story is an indication of how Teresa was able to stir up trouble and be able to get other people to do what she thought was right. After this incident, she led a fairly ordinary life, though she was convinced that she was a horrible sinner. As a teenager, she cared only about boys and clothes and flirting and rebelling. When she was 16, her father decided that she was just too much trouble and just getting too wild, and so he sent her to a convent, which is what people did in those days. They sent their wild daughters to a convent. At first, she hated being there, but then she grew to really enjoy it and love it, and partly because it was way less strict than her father had been. So she had more freedom. Still, when the time came for her to make the decision as to whether or not to stay in the convent or to get married and lead a worldly life, she had a very difficult time making the decision. But she finally chose the religious life, and she basically thought it was the only safe place for her because she was such a sinner. So that's Teresa's understanding and view of herself at that time. Once she had decided and she was in the Carmelite convent permanently, she started to develop and practice mental prayer. So this was something that she says about it. I tried as hard as I could to keep Jesus Christ present with me. My imagination is so dull that I had no talent for imagining or coming up with great theological thoughts. So Teresa prayed this way, mental prayer, on and off for 18 years without feeling that she was getting any results. Part of the reason for her trouble was that the convent was not the safe place that she had assumed it would be. Many women who had no place else to go wound up in the convent. So people who were poor, destitute, or people who were from wealthy families, but they were so wild that their parents sent them to the convent. So we had a power outage, and I'm going to continue talking about St. Theresa of Avila, and then we'll record this and post it online so at least you can see the satsang at some point, even if we can't continue live. Anyway, so as I was saying, many people entered a convent in those days, whether or not they had a vocation. The convents accepted dowries, and so, wealthy families would get their daughters into a convent that way. People in the convent were encouraged to go home and visit their families for extended periods of time to ease the expenses of the convents. So it wasn't a cloistered situation at all. And nuns would dress very attractively. They would arrange their veils in such a way, and they would wear jewelry and so on. Prestige depended not on piety, but on money. There was a steady stream of visitors in the convent parlors, and they included young men. So what spirituality there was often, as they say, hysteria, weeping, self-induced visions, and exaggerated penance. So it was quite a scene that she was into. And Teresa suffered from the same thing that St. Francis had, which is that they were extremely charming, and people loved them, and they loved being loved. So she found it very easy to slip into a worldly life and to forget all about God. Now, she forgot about God. Isn't that familiar? We get so involved in life that we just ignore God. The convent encouraged her to have visitors, to teach this concept of mental prayer because they got gifts from her students. So it helped the community economy. And Teresa got more and more involved in flattery, vanity, gossip. These things kept her from God. Then she fell ill with malaria. She had a seizure, and people thought she was dead. She was in a coma, just inert, for 4 days. Now, when she got sick, she went home. Or maybe it happened while she was home, I'm not sure. But people thought she was dead. They dug a grave for her. And her father refused to give up her body. Her father was convinced she was not dead. Thank God, because at the end of 4 days, the nuns came to claim the body to be buried, and they found her sitting up on the bed talking to her father. So they had to go home. But she never truly recovered from this illness. She was always in a little bit of frail health from then on. For 3 years, she was paralyzed completely. Yet instead of helping her spiritually, her sickness became an excuse to stop prayer completely. And so she used this illness as an excuse. She wasn't healthy enough to pray. She didn't feel well enough to pray. All these sorts of things. Doesn't that all sound familiar? We find these excuses not to go to God. So she would say later, prayer is an act of love. Words are not needed. Even if sickness distracts from thoughts of God, all that is needed is the will to love. What wonderful advice when we don't feel well, when too much is going on. We just have to turn towards God, just have that will